The report's going to be released. Attorney General Barr is working with Mueller on what to redact and what to release. So the report's going to be released. This is absolutely a political ploy of the left because what they know is there's going to be information redacted and they're going to have Democrats crying foul and saying that there's a cover up here or something nefarious is going on, even though we all know there's not. And if Democrats are serious about getting to the bottom of the way that Russia has influenced and impacted this nation, it's through the dossier. It's not $300 spent on Facebook ads in Pennsylvania. We know they didn't change any votes. We were told that by the Obama administration. So where did they have the biggest impact? It was the dossier. The FBI used it to obtain FISA warrants. They weaponized it. It was pushed by our national media. It was pushed by the Democrats. And it was a Democratic-funded Russian disinformation document because we know that Russian sources were the sources that Christopher Steele used. Former and current intel officers, a foreign Russian ministry officer. That is where Russia made the biggest impact. So if they're actually serious about looking at Russia, they would get to the bottom of the dossier in the way that it was used by the intel community.
About investigating the investigators.
Exactly.
I think there's another point to be made here. We saw in the Mueller investigation what we saw from the indictments, that he indicted a number of Russian individuals, including folks as high up to the Kremlin, folks who were involved in internet farms, folks who were involved in all sorts of dirty dealings. And I think it's very important for the American people and our Congress individuals to know what they did, how they did it, so we can pass laws to ensure that our democracy is protected in the upcoming election.
Okay, with the matter at hand, Brett, I'll let you answer this. Alan Dershowitz last hour here on our program talking about the politics involved in this subpoena push.
This is all about politics. They, the Democrats, want to make sure that the Republicans are perceived as those who stop the Americans from seeing the report. They have to obey the law. A report includes material that can never be unpublished once it's published. Grand jury material, classified information, privileged information. And so a court would never, or never should, issue a blanket subpoena for everything.
You went on to say the Supreme Court would not take this case. I don't know if that's the case or not, but go ahead, Brett.
I agree with the professor, and it's the points I made earlier. There are certain things that are protected as a matter of law, and all the kicking and screaming by Democrats will not change the law and not change their entitlement to information they're not entitled to.
Well, we'll see where this fight goes on Capitol Hill. That meeting continues, and we'll continue to watch that. Stand by. Two more women now coming forward to accuse Joe Biden, the former vice president, of inappropriate touching. The growing list of accusations casting a shadow over his presidential ambitions as the former vice president faces scrutiny over his past behavior toward women. Garrett Tenney's live in Washington with the latest on all of this. Garrett, good morning.
Sandra, good morning to you. Like the first two women who came forward, these latest allegations suggest that Joe Biden's physical interactions crossed a line. And while they were not sexual in nature, they were a bit too familiar and personal for these women. According to the New York Times, 22-year-old Caitlin Caruso claims Biden put his hand on her thigh and hugged her a little too long 3 years ago on UNLV's campus during an event about sexual assault, where she had just shared her own story of surviving assault. The fourth accuser, 59-year-old DJ Hill, told the Times that her encounter was at a fundraising event in Minneapolis in 2012. She said during a picture, the vice president put his hand on her shoulder, but then started dropping his hand down her back until her husband noticed and interrupted by making a joke and putting his hand on Biden's shoulder. Last night, President Trump weighed in on the accusations during a House GOP fundraising dinner, and he jumped on the idea that other Democratic campaigns are pushing these stories out to hurt Biden's chances.
It looks like the only non-sort of heavy socialist, he's being taken care of pretty well by the socialists they got to him. Our former vice president, I was going to call him, I don't know him well, I was going to say, welcome to the world, Joe. You having a good time, Joe?
Several Biden advisors reportedly believe that folks tied to Bernie Sanders' campaign are behind an anti-Biden effort. Sanders' campaign strongly denies that and tells us it has nothing to do with these stories. Sandra and Bill.
All right, Garrett Tenney, thank you.
Back with our A-team. Lisa, what do you think? Where do you think this is going with Biden?
To me, this shows how disingenuous those on the left are about the Me Too movement, because you have people that are choosing to weaponize it against Joe Biden who don't want him to run. And then you have people saying that there's nothing to see here, it's not a big deal, because they think Joe Biden's the strongest candidate to run, so they're willing to look the other way. So to me, it shows the disingenuousness of the left on the Me Too movement. I also think it's very dumb for Democrats to put all their hopes in Joe Biden. I've been saying this. This is a guy who has not shown himself to be a formidable candidate. This is a guy who has 2 failed presidential bids under his belt. This is a guy who hasn't really ran a tough race since his first Senate race in 1972. And what's interesting is, imagine a crowded primary field on the stage. Does Joe Biden stand out? The way that President Trump separated himself was that first RNC debate, or the first Republican debate, where they asked, are you going to support, are you going to support whoever wins the nomination? And President Trump was the only one that raised his hand, basically saying, I don't know if I'm willing to do that. So the point being is, it's going to be whoever ends up standing out in this crowded primary field that we see on the left. Who knows who's that going to be? We don't know.
Richard?
Well, a couple of things. I think one, this is a very interesting story. I know the vice president. I've actually shared an Accelerate with the vice president. And the entire Accelerate I shared with him, he had his hand on my shoulder. He was talking to me about where I came from, asked me about my mother. He's a very familiar person. This is how he shows affection. This is how he shows that he cares about somebody. These stories are very disheartening. I think that I think Secretary Bill Bennett said in the last segment, right, that the new rules need to be really redefined on how people interact with each other. And I think that's really important. I said this all along as this Me Too movement has developed, is we need to make sure that we educate young men and boys. We need to educate older men and boys, clearly at this rate, about what the new rules are and how they should apply. And I think that's also very important. But I will say that this is just who Joe Biden is. He's a very familiar person.
Speaking of which, here's the New York Post cover from this morning, in case you missed it. No more liberties. Joe Biden giving the Statue of Liberty a hug. Brad?
Joe Biden has become a caricature. And when you become a caricature, it sticks. All you have to do is put Creepy Joe in Google, and you're going to have all these videos of him acting inappropriately towards women. So it is a label now that has stuck to Joe Biden. And I think that Democrats should act with caution with allegations that they treat Republicans differently than they treat Democrats when accusations are made. But Joe is Creepy Joe, and that's the way it's going to be.
I want to push back on that, because Alyssa Milano, who is one of the pillars of the Me Too movement, she released a tweet yesterday talking about just this. She says, Joe Biden has done immense work for women. And not only did he champion the Violence Against Women's Act, but he's done beyond that in fighting and standing up for women. So I think to call
So
him,
did Brett Kavanaugh, without accusations that were based in fact, and Democrats
crucified. I'm talking. And I think to say that, that he's Creepy Joe is a disrespect to what he stood for. It's disrespectful to the office of the vice presidency, and it's also disrespectful to the fact that he served decades in the United States Senate.
Then you better write a letter to Google, because when you Google Creepy Joe,
I'm talking about you calling him Creepy Joe.
No, I was quoting what you can do on the internet.
Let's be honest. The left only cares about the Me Too movement when it can be weaponized, when it can be used as a political weapon to, be a battering ram against their political opponent. Case in point, Brett Kavanaugh. Sure. There were no witnesses that stepped forward to say that what Christine Ford was saying or any of these other accusers were saying was true. There was no collaborative information. I mean, there was corroborative information, but there was nothing there. And Democrats chose to weaponize it at the 11th hour to try to hurt Brett Kavanaugh. Yet you've got these accusers with Justin Fairfax. Who cares on the left about that? You've got pictures of Joe Biden being creepy, yet Democrats are trying to excuse it. So the left only cares about it when they can use it as a political weapon. Otherwise, they don't care. These women don't deserve to be heard unless they can use it as a political weapon.
I want to push back on that. We spent Monday and Tuesday, another network spent 2 days talking about Lieutenant Governor Fairfax ad nauseum. Number one. Number two, I think that the Me Too movement has been on both sides of the aisle, taking down men who have done horrible things, whether it's Harvey Weinstein, a man of who one would argue is on the left.
It only took 3 decades.
Or Matt Lauer, or Charlie Rose, or Les Moonves. We can
but
go
everybody
on
knew
and
it was
on
happening,
and on.
and nobody did it for decades.
I just wonder, though, so I've been searching Alyssa Milano's Twitter page because she came out with this statement about Joe Biden. She posted a picture of herself with him. There's a series of 4 tweets about this situation with Joe Biden. I don't see a lot about the accusers. I don't think I see anything at first glance, and I've been looking for a couple minutes here. But why wouldn't she come out as you put it, a pillar of the Me Too movement, and say something about the accusers who have come forward and say that he has made them uncomfortable?
I mean, that's the question for Alyssa Milano, right? But what I would argue is that one would argue, as she said in her tweets, Joe Biden in his history has shown nothing but a respect for women and standing up for women. He championed, after the Anita Hill hearing, he wrote and authored the Violence Against Women's Act, which makes it easier for women to stand up and fight against their accusers.
Look, I don't think Joe Biden is some sort of sexual predator, but he's creepy. And there are numerous photos. There's going to be 1,000 stories like these women that have stepped forward, because we've all seen it. We've seen the video of the swearing in. We've seen the photos of him getting too handsy with people. So it's out there, and it's not going to end. And Democrats have to decide what they're going to do about it. And he has to decide if he wants to run and go through that.